The door creaked open, and the man froze in shock at the sight before him. A battered German shepherd, covered in blood and barely able to stand, stood at the threshold. His fur was torn, stained red, and his breaths came in ragged gasps. Despite the agony evident in his posture, the dog mustered the strength to lift his head, locking eyes with the man in a silent plea for help. The man hesitated, his mind racing. He had lived alone in a remote cabin in Montana for years, far removed from the chaos of city life. He had seen wild animals struggle against nature's cruelty, but he had never encountered something like this. The dog took a trembling step forward, as if trying to prove he was still alive, then collapsed just inches from the doorway. The sight sent a jolt through the man's chest. What happened next would shake him to his core and forever alter both of their lives. The only sound in the room was the dog's ragged breathing. Each wheezing gasp was a painful reminder of the injuries he had endured. Blood seeped into the fresh snow, a stark contrast against the white, marking the trail of suffering he had traveled to reach this doorstep. The man swallowed hard, unable to move. This was no ordinary stray. Despite his exhaustion and pain, there was something fierce in the shepherd's eyes, something that spoke of survival. "Stay with me, buddy," the man murmured, lowering himself beside the dog. He had no idea how to help. The nearest town was miles away, and he was completely alone. But the dog's wounds were too severe to ignore. A deep gash along his side oozed blood, and there was no sign of an owner. The man took a shaky breath and reached out cautiously, sliding a hand beneath the shepherd's chin. The dog flinched slightly but did not pull away. Their eyes met again. This time, the man saw more than just pain. He saw trust. It was as if the dog knew this man was his only chance. That realization settled heavily in the man's chest. "All right, boy. I got you." His voice was steady, but inside, he was anything but. Carefully, he lifted the dog into his arms, supporting as much of the weight as possible. The shepherd didn't resist. Instead, he leaned into him, trembling violently but not struggling. For years, the man had lived in solitude, content with his quiet life. But this wasn't about loneliness. This was an emergency. In that moment, two strangers, man and dog, were bound together by fate, by survival, by a moment that would define them both. As he carried the dog inside, he stole one last glance over his shoulder. Outside, the brutal Montana winter loomed, threatening to swallow them whole. But as the door clicked shut behind them, the man knew one thing for certain: this dog wasn't dying tonight. The warmth inside the cabin seemed to revive the shepherd, but the man knew it wasn't enough. He had to do more. He laid the dog down carefully by the fireplace. The shepherd sagged into his arms, completely spent. Blood still trickled from his wounds, and his half-lidded eyes struggled to stay open. "Hold on, buddy," the man whispered, hurrying to grab his first aid kit. He wasn't a vet, but after years of living off the grid, he had learned how to treat cuts and injuries. He grabbed gauze, antiseptic, and clean towels, his hands slightly shaking as he worked. As he cleaned the wounds, the dog's eyes never left him. Despite the pain, despite everything, there was no fear, only quiet gratitude. The minutes stretched into hours. The fire crackled softly in the background as the man stitched wounds, cleaned blood, and dressed injuries. Eventually, the dog's breathing evened out, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. The man exhaled, sinking onto the floor beside him. He had no idea who this dog was or where he had come from, but none of that mattered. What mattered was right now. He had saved this dog's life. And, in ways he didn't yet understand, this dog was about to change his own. The dog had come to him for a reason. Not just for survival, but for something deeper. Something unbreakable. As the shepherd slept by the fire, the man stared out the window, lost in thought. Why had this dog come here? How had he survived whatever horror he'd been through? Whatever the answers were, the man knew one thing: this story wasn't over. There was more pain to endure, more trust to earn. And somehow, he knew he would be facing it all with this dog by his side. The next morning, the cabin was eerily quiet except for the soft crackling of the fire. The man had barely slept. He kept thinking about the injured German shepherd lying on his floor. When he finally pushed himself upright, his muscles ached. His eyes flickered toward the dog. He hadn't moved much. His body remained tense, his breathing shallow. "Still hanging in there, buddy," the man murmured, stepping closer carefully. The dog was alive, but barely. His chest rose and fell in weak, uneven breaths. Kneeling beside him, the man reached out, palm open. This time, the shepherd didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting the man's with something that sent a sharp ache through his chest: fear, gratitude, and uncertainty all tangled together. The man swallowed hard. "You're a fighter, I can see that," he whispered, running a gentle hand over the shepherd's head. "We're gonna get through this, okay?" The dog's tail twitched, the weakest wag, but it was enough. Despite everything, despite the odds stacked against him, he was still fighting. But the fight wasn't over yet. The man knew the harsh reality of survival in the wild. Time wasn't on their side. The dog needed food, warmth, and most of all, answers. Where had he come from? Was someone looking for him? And more importantly, what had done this to him? Taking a deep breath, the man pushed to his feet and headed to the small kitchen. Rummaging through supplies, he found some leftover chicken and broth, not much, but enough to start. When he returned, he saw the shepherd struggling, his legs trembling as he tried to lift himself. "Easy, easy," the man muttered, setting the bowl down. The dog hesitated, glancing between him and the food. Then, as if his instincts finally overpowered his pride, he lowered his head and started lapping up the broth. The man watched silently, an odd sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the land blanketed in thick Montana snow. The cabin felt even smaller, even lonelier than before. For years, the man had chosen this solitude. He liked the quiet, the peace. But now, with this dog beside him, he realized something. His life of isolation had left him vulnerable. What if this shepherd had belonged to someone? What if he had a family? And most importantly, who or what had done this to him? The man clenched his jaw, forcing the thoughts aside. Now wasn't the time to dwell on the past, he had to focus on the present. The shepherd finished eating and, exhausted, collapsed onto the floor once more. The man knelt beside him, carefully checking his wounds. The dried blood had stiffened in his fur, and the cut still looked raw, but the worst of the bleeding had stopped. As he worked, the dog let out a soft whimper, barely audible but full of pain. The man paused, his fingers tightening against the bandages. This wasn't just about saving an injured animal. This meant something more. The dog had come to him for a reason. And even though their bond was still fragile, it was real. He was no longer just a stray. He was his responsibility now. The man exhaled and wiped his forehead. "All right, buddy. We've done all we can for now," he murmured. But there was still one pressing question. Was this dog truly alone? And if not, what had caused those injuries? Days began to blur together as the man fell into a routine. He cleaned wounds, rationed food, and kept the fire burning. Slowly but surely, the shepherd began to heal. His fur, still matted and stained with blood, was growing healthier. His breathing became stronger. But most importantly, he began to trust. Every time the dog looked up at him, there was something in those eyes, something the man couldn't quite describe. Gratitude. Recognition. A silent understanding. Yet, despite the progress, something didn't sit right. Something was missing. The shepherd had been through hell, but from what? One morning, after feeding the dog and making sure he had enough water, the man made a decision. We need answers. The storm had cleared, leaving behind crisp, fresh snow. The air was still, the sky an open stretch of blue. For the first time since the shepherd had arrived, the man stepped outside. The world was quiet, too quiet. He surveyed the surrounding forest, the untouched snow, searching for anything out of place. Nothing. No footprints. No trails. If this shepherd had come from a home or a town, there should have been some sign of it. But there wasn't. That meant only one thing. He had come from the wilderness. And whatever had hurt him was still out there. The man's fists clenched. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The stranger was getting closer. The man's pulse quickened as he stared at the approaching figure in the distance. He couldn't tell who they were, but one thing was clear, they were heading straight for the cabin. He spun on his heel, heading back inside. Was this someone looking for the dog? Or was this something else entirely? As he shut the door behind him, he felt eyes on him. The shepherd, still curled up by the fire, had lifted his head. Despite his exhaustion, his gaze was sharp, alert, as if he knew something the man didn't. The dog trembled but stood. His legs were weak, but there was resolve in his movements. "Stay here," the man ordered, his voice lower than he intended. But as he grabbed his jacket and stepped back out into the cold, his chest was tight with unease. Something felt wrong. As he walked toward the figure, his mind raced. Could this person be connected to the dog? An owner? Someone searching for him? But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was something else. The closer he got, the more details became clear. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn, weather-beaten clothes. A heavy pack hung from his back. His face was rough, windburned, but his eyes. Something about them felt off. Not just wary, but almost familiar. "Hey," the man called out, raising a hand. "Who are you? What are you doing out here?" The stranger stopped. His gaze flicked between the man and the cabin behind him. Then, he spoke, his voice low, almost cautious. "I was about to ask you the same thing." The man frowned, taking a step closer. "I live here. The question is, why are you wandering through these woods?" The stranger hesitated. Then, with an unreadable expression, he asked. "That dog inside. What do you know about him?" The man stiffened. "What's it to you?" At the mention of the shepherd, the stranger's face darkened. His posture shifted, not aggressive, but tense. Then, he spoke words that sent a chill colder than the Montana wind down the man's spine. "That's not just any dog. He's a working dog. Trained for something much more dangerous than you realize." The man's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" The stranger's gaze flicked back toward the cabin. "You need to keep that dog locked up. For your safety. And his." Something about the way he said it unnerved the man. "What kind of training?" he demanded. But before he could get an answer, the stranger turned away. "Stay out of it," he warned over his shoulder, before vanishing into the trees. The man stood frozen, his breath turning to mist in the frigid air. What the hell just happened? That man knew something. Something about the shepherd. Something he wasn't saying. Back inside, the fire crackled softly. The shepherd was still watching the door, his body tense. The man exhaled, kneeling beside him. "Who the hell are you?" he muttered, running a hand over the dog's head. The shepherd didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at him, deep and steady, like he understood every word. And for the first time, the man had a terrible thought. Maybe this wasn't just a rescue. Maybe, this was something much bigger. The knock at the door wasn't friendly. The man's pulse hammered in his ears as he reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. Outside, footsteps crunched in the snow. Low voices, 2, maybe 3, spoke in hushed, firm tones. The stranger inside the cabin tensed. "They're here," he muttered. His voice tight with fear. The shepherd, once too weak to stand, rose to his feet. His posture had changed. No longer a wounded stray, but a trained soldier. And he was ready to fight. The man took a shaky breath, then eased the door open just enough to see. Outside, 2 men stood in the snow. Both were dressed in black coats, armed, their posture stiff and deliberate. They weren't lost hikers. They weren't looking for shelter. They were here for the dog. One of them stepped forward, his breath visible in the icy air. "We know he's in there," he said, calmly but firmly. The man tightened his grip on the rifle. "Who the hell are you?" The second man, a bit taller, took another step. "That's classified." His gaze flicked toward the shepherd inside. "Calculating. Cold. Step aside. We're taking him back." The shepherd growled low, the sound deep and warning. The fur on his back bristled. "Like hell you are," the man shot back. The 2 strangers exchanged a glance. And then, the taller one reached into his coat. The man lifted the rifle in response, heart pounding. Slowly. The stranger didn't stop. The man's finger tightened on the trigger. And then. The shepherd lunged forward, slamming into the doorframe, his teeth bared in a flash of white. The men outside reacted instantly, stepping back, hands darting toward their weapons. The stranger inside the cabin moved fast, grabbing the man's arm. "Close the door." The man slammed it shut, bolting it. A second later, a thud, someone had tried to kick it open. "They won't stop," the stranger said, breathing hard. Outside, voices barked orders, boots crunched on snow, and then. Gunfire shattered the air. The cabin's front window exploded. The shepherd whipped around, his instincts razor-sharp. The man ducked low, adrenaline surging. This wasn't just about a stray dog anymore. This was a hunt. And they were the prey. The roar of the approaching helicopter sent a chill down the man's spine. The beating of the blades grew louder, slicing through the icy air, drowning out the sounds of struggle beneath. The 2 intruders, though bruised and battered, seemed almost relieved by the sound. Reinforcements were coming. The man tightened his grip on the injured shepherd, his heart pounding. They couldn't stay here. The fight had already pushed them to the limit, and now, with more enemies incoming, survival was slipping through his fingers like sand. "Move," he hissed, grabbing the dog's collar. The shepherd, still trembling from the effects of the device, locked eyes with him. Uncertainty flickered in the dog's amber gaze, but there was something else there, too. Determination. They weren't giving up. The 2 intruders staggered back to their feet, one clutching his bleeding arm, the other reaching for his weapon. The man saw the movement out of the corner of his eye, but there was no time to react. Before he could stop him, the second man aimed a pistol directly at the shepherd. No. Adrenaline surged through his veins. Without thinking, the man lunged. A gunshot rang out, deafening in the confined space of the cabin. Pain exploded in his shoulder. He hit the ground hard, a searing heat blooming where the bullet had grazed him. But the moment he fell, the shepherd was already moving. The dog launched himself forward, ignoring the pain still racking his body. His powerful jaws clamped down on the gunman's wrist, a deep, guttural growl rumbling from his throat. The intruder howled in agony as the shepherd twisted, forcing him to drop the weapon. The man, gritting his teeth against the pain, forced himself to his feet. He couldn't focus on the injury now. They had to escape. Through the open doorway, the helicopter was visible now, its floodlight cutting through the swirling snow, illuminating the cabin like a spotlight on a stage. The man cursed under his breath. They had seconds, at best. His mind raced. They needed an escape route. The truck was too far. Running in open terrain was suicide. Then, an idea hit him. Back door, he muttered to himself. The shepherd, as if sensing his thoughts, backed away from the writhing intruder, falling into step beside him. The man grabbed a duffel bag, emergency supplies, an old rifle, whatever he could carry, and yanked open the back door. Snow swirled in the air, the wind howling through the trees. It was a gamble, but it was their only shot. Go, he urged. The shepherd didn't hesitate. Together, they disappeared into the stormy darkness, leaving behind the wreckage of the cabin, the shouts of their pursuers, and the whirring blades of the machine that hunted them. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for now, they ran. The man took a deep breath, his heart still pounding from the chaos they had just escaped. Smoke billowed from the wreckage behind them, a stark reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. But they had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. The shepherd stood beside him, his amber eyes scanning the horizon, ears twitching at every distant sound. He was battered, exhausted, but still standing. A survivor, just like him. The man reached down, running his fingers through the dog's thick fur. "We did it, buddy," he murmured. The shepherd didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, the smallest sign of trust. For the first time in what felt like forever, the man allowed himself to smile. They weren't running from something anymore. They were running toward something, a future, a second chance. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that. Their enemies wouldn't stop looking, and there were still too many unanswered questions about what the shepherd had been through, about the men who had tried to take him. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, they were free. The shepherd wagged his tail, just slightly, but enough. A silent promise passed between them. No matter what came next, they would face it together. The man turned away from the wreckage, from the past, from everything that had tried to break them. He placed a steady hand on the dog's back, and together, they walked into the unknown. Side by side. Unstoppable.